So let's go ahead and get started. So hey everyone, my name is James, and I'm going to try and teach you a little bit about what we call the DOM. Just let me know if you have any questions or comments. I would love to get any feedback that you have. So let's go ahead and start. I've got a few slides here, so let's get that started. Okay, and yeah, my contact information is going to be here on the slides, and I'll probably get them posted in PDF format or something whenever we post this video. Okay, so let's get started. So let's talk about JavaScript a little bit. JavaScript, depending on who you ask, is the most popular programming language in use today. For pretty much any modern web application, they're going to have JavaScript in there somewhere. If you're doing anything on the web, you're using JavaScript. So even if technically most popular, like anything that you do is going to have some JavaScript component to it. So the question is, why do we use JavaScript? JavaScript lets us do some very interesting things with web pages. It lets us interact with it in a way that just standard HTML does not. So it's a very important language. If you want to do anything that has a really nice interface and feels like it's nearly a desktop application, you need to know some JavaScript. So the first thing we're going to start with is fiddling around in the JavaScript console. So the JavaScript console is built into basically every modern web browser, and it lets us run little bits of code here and there. So I've got a few examples here. You can do basic arithmetic. You can deal with strings of characters. You can do a lot of different stuff. So let me show you here how you access that. So if you're on OS X and you have Chrome or Firefox, the command is pretty much the same. You do Command-Alt-I. On Windows, there are a few different options here depending on if you're using Chrome or Firefox or Internet Explorer. So let's go ahead and pop over into Chrome here and do a little stuff. Let's clear this console. So like I was saying before, you can do things like simple arithmetic. So 2 plus 2 equals 4. You can do more complicated things like 10 times 2 plus 5, and that'll equal 25. And I guess I should also go real quick over how we determine the order of operations. As you know, there's no reason why 5 plus 2 couldn't be executed first and then do times 10, which would give us 70. 5 plus 2 is 7, times 10 is 70. And the reason why that is because of a little acronym called PEMDAS, which you may have heard before. So PEMDAS. What that means is that the way that we determine which one we execute first is based on this list. So first we execute anything that's in parentheses, that's the P. Next we do exponents. Next we do multiplication, then division, then addition, and lastly subtraction. So if I put this in parentheses, if I do 10 times 2 plus 5, then it's going to execute the thing that is in the parentheses first. So we're going to get 7 times 10, and that's going to equal 70. So if you've never heard of that before, it's something that you will probably come across many times. Oh, it's not sharing the screen. Oh, well, did I not turn that back on? Nope, I didn't. All right, let's share that again. All right. Okay, let's go ahead and go back over this real quick. Mostly my slides were fairly lightweight, so we'll just breeze through them again. So we talked about what JavaScript is and why we want to use it. We're going to show the console again here in a second. And then these are how we access the console. So there are a few different commands depending on whether or not you're on OS X or Windows. So corresponds to what you're using here. Okay, so let's go back over into our JavaScript console and clear. Oh, that's right. Console here. Okay, and again, we'll just leave this here. PEMDOS. So yeah, if we do 10 times 5 plus 2, we get 52. If we do 10 times 5 plus 2 using parentheses here, then we'll get 70. So that is how this works. That's how the computer figures out which one it's supposed to execute first. So that's a useful little thing. World. We can do things like find out how long our string is using this .length function, and that gives us 11. We can even do something like splitting this into pieces based on a particular character. So this function is going to let me split this into pieces, and the character that we're going to split on is this space. So it should give us in the end hello and world in different chunks. So yeah, so it's split it up into 2 different chunks. So there are a lot of little things that you can do here in the JavaScript console. This is really good for hacking, for just trying out simple things that you want to know about. I use this a lot when I'm trying to figure out my first pass at something, figuring out if I can do something. So yeah, this is really great, and we'll probably use it a little more. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is files. Files are where we're going. The first is organization. When you're developing a large web page, you really want to try and separate your JavaScript from your HTML, the thing that is actually rendered by the web browser. It makes it a little bit easier for you to manage your code as it grows in complexity, and it also allows you to reuse some of that code. So if you write some JavaScript to do to be some kind of a calculator or something, and you decide that you want to later use that on another project you're working on, if you don't have it well organized and separated into different files, it's going to be a little difficult. So we are going to do most of our work now inside of files and in the web browser itself. So let's go ahead and look at how we use files. So the way that we access these JavaScripts that we're going to put in different files from our HTML is going to be using the HTML script tag. So the script tag lets us tell where it is that we're storing this code. So we have an example here. We can tell if we want to load the JavaScript that is in this myscript.js file, which would be sitting right next to the HTML file in the same folder. Or we can even giving it a URL to some JavaScript out on the web. So we can do either of these, and we're actually going to end up doing both of these as we go further along. We're going to actually use this jQuery tag when we get a little bit further into the lesson. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a sample little file here and do some things with it. Let's bring up our text editor here. Actually, let's do this. Let's close that real quick and go into this folder I've created and open our text editor here. So we are going to create a couple of files here. First, we're going to create a simple HTML file. And then we're also going to add this myscript.js file. Okay, so we talked about the script tag, but now we really need to know where we need to put it. So if you've ever looked at a simple HTML document, it has a pretty similar format. We start with an HTML element with this closing tag. for anything that we're trying to use here. Next, we have the head tag, and head is where we put our script tags. Head stands for header. It just means that it has content user to be able to see. It holds things like your script tags and things like you're actively trying to put in front of the eyeballs of your users. So we're going to use the source element to tell it where, or source attribute to tell it where we want to look for our code. And we're going to put it right here in myscript.js. And again, because it's just as simple as putting in the name of the file, that means that it's going to expect the file. And let's go ahead and put a body. That's also another important thing to have. This is where we keep the content that we want to put in front of our user. And then we're going to go ahead and use an h1 element to put some text. And we're going to say, hello world. Okay, so now let's go and open up this file. Hello world. So this is fine, and now what we want to do is actually write a little JavaScript here. So let's go back into our editor here, and now we need to talk a little bit about format. A JavaScript inside of a file. So we haven't talked about variables yet, so let's talk about, let's pop back into our console for a second. So variables are how you actually store things that you want to use later. So, you know, before we did our addition here, we added up two numbers, and that's great, but what if we want to do something with those later? So let's go ahead and say we call this sum. We're going to call a new variable sum, and we're going to say that this is 2 plus 2. So now we have sum, and sum now equals 4. So if we type sum, then we'll see that it equals 4. So we can do some things like sum equals sum plus another 2. So this lets us add, it says that we're going to take the current value of sum, add 2 to it, and then save it into sum again. So now it's 6. So again, if we type sum to see what its value is, it's going to be 6. And we can do other things like doing multiplication. So we can say sum times 3. So this says that we're going to multiply the current value of sum, which is 6, times 3, and we should expect to see 18. And we see 18. And if we type sum again, then we get 18. So this is an example of a variable. We can use it in many different ways. Like, let's see, what if we want to do something like put this into a string? So message, and we'll say that the value of sum is and we get as simple as adding sum to this string. So if we type that in, and then we see the value of sum is 18. If we type message to get the value that's stored in message, then we see, again, the value of sum is 18. Okay, so that's how we deal with variables in the console. Now let's look at how we deal with them inside of a JavaScript file. So the first thing that we need to know about is the var keyword. A keyword is a word that is reserved by the language that we're using. So in this case, var is a keyword that lets us say, hey, compiler, I want to store a variable, so I'm going to give you this keyword, and then I'm going to give you the name of my variable, and And then we also need to put a semicolon on the end. The semicolon tells the compiler, hey, this is the end of my statement. This is what I want you to execute. So let's start with sum equal 2 plus 2. Okay, so we've saved that. So we've got our scripts, or our HTML file over here pointing at my script.js. And we've got our variable here. So let's reload the page again, and let's see what happens. Let's reload. And unless we tell it to. So let's go ahead and try using this. This is called a console. So we're going to do a console log, which lets us print the or print something to the JavaScript console. So we can do that, and we can give it some, and let's make it a little prettier by saying value of sum is 4. So that's how you know that or that's how one of the ways that you can know that your code is actually executing is by using console log statements to print things out so that you can see them in action. Okay, so let's see, what do we want to talk about next? Okay. So next we're going to talk about functions and events. So functions let us do things that are a bit more complicated. Because right now so far we've been doing just kind of simple arithmetic, one thing at a time, not doing anything particularly complicated, and that's fine for what we're doing for the most part. But if we want to do something more complicated, then we need to use functions. Functions are nice also because they allow us to do these complicated things multiple times. So if we have a function that's supposed to do a bunch of addition and subtraction over and over, we can write a function to do that, and then we can do that anytime we want without having to continually rewrite that same code over and over. So functions are nice. They allow us to do things a little bit more easily. So let's go ahead and write a sample function here. All right. So we're going to start with a simple one. We're going to say add 2 numbers, first number, and the second number. So this is the format of our function definition. We start with the def keyword. That tells us, hey, or no, I'm sorry, I'm thinking of the wrong language. It's actually function. A function I'd like for you to execute for me. The next thing you tell it is what the name of your function. Start with a lowercase letter. You also can't start them with numbers, otherwise it won't work. So usually we go with what's called camel case, which is the first letter of the word is lowercase, but after that the first letter of every other word is uppercase. And then next we have what's called the argument list. So this is the things that we want from our function is going to add 2 numbers together, so we need 2 numbers to add. I've named the first one first number and the second one second number, so pretty straightforward. Next, we need some curly braces. These tell the compiler where our function begins and where it ends, so we need both of those in order for it to work. Lastly, we need to add in our second number. And again, we're going to end that with a semicolon there. And let's go ahead and put this in a variable. Let's say variable sum equals first number plus second number. And then let's return the sum. So return is a keyword that tells the compiler, this is the value that I want my function to return. So if somebody calls this function, gives it these arguments, then I want to give them back the value that comes after return. So that's what we're going to do here. So now we've got our function definition, and now we want to go ahead and use it. So we're going to go ahead and call this function. And in this case, it'll be, let's just go ahead and replace our existing 2 plus 2 with this. So let's say add 2 numbers, 2, comma, we separate the values that we're sending in as arguments using this comma. So this now is going to be what ends up being first number. This is what ends up being second number, and then they're going to be added together inside this function. So if we save our file and go back to our web page and reload, we should see the same thing show up when we reload if I've done this correctly. And is still 4. Let me fix that spacing a little bit. Okay, so if I change this to be 3 and save, then we reload it, and now it's 5. So, I mentioned things, but I haven't really done anything complicated. So let's see how we can make this a little more complicated. So we can do add. Let's see. I'm trying to think of a good simple problem that we could do. That's okay. Okay, let's leave it at this for now, and we'll do maybe some more complicated functions when we go a little bit further. Okay. So we're talking about functions. Now let's talk a little bit about events. So events are how your web browser keeps track of things that are going on that might be important to you and lets you know that it happened. So the nice thing about events is that you can wire a function to an event so that when something important happens, you execute a function. So for instance, if somebody clicks on a button, you might have something that pops up and says, some kind of message, like if they're clicking a delete button, is loaded or refreshed, you can execute some events. So if you have some kind of welcome message you want to display to somebody, you can do it with that event. And additionally, you can do things like executing events when certain items on your page are moused over. So if you want to animate some kind of a picture when somebody mouses over it, that's something that you could do with that sort of event. So that's what events are. They're pretty powerful, and they let us react to things that the user's doing, and that's really powerful. So let's go ahead and wire up a quick little function here for an event. Okay, so we've got our 2 numbers here. I think I just used button. Okay, we do have a little button here now. So what I change the text that we have here. And let me see here. So it needs to be something along the lines of function, let's just call this do something for now. And we're not going to take any arguments. Let's just go ahead and do this. Let's start with just having an alert when we click on that button. Alert. You click this. So we have our function definition. It's got our curly braces showing where it begins and ends. And we are going to use this built-in function called alert. alert, whenever you call it, creates a little pop-up message. So we've got our function here. Whenever this function runs, it's going to bring up this alert, and now we want to wire it into a click event. Text is on that real quick. Event on button. Unfortunately, I had to give my talk a little bit earlier than I expected, so this is one of the things that I was looking at beforehand, so my apologies here. Okay, so this is how we're going to wire up our onClick event here. So you see that onClick is something that we can put into, or as an attribute on our button here. So let's go ahead and pop back over to our handy text editor and go to our HTML, and then here on button we're going to say onClick equals do something, and we're going to save that. Let's put something in here. That now when we go back, we wrote earlier. Well, object, click. Let's see, did I misdefine my function? Function. Okay, function do something. Did I put the wrong thing here? That looks correct. There we go. So I must have spelled it incorrectly. So now when we click on the button, it brings up that alert. So events are really cool. They're really handy things and let us do a lot of stuff that we otherwise wouldn't be able to do. All right. And yeah, that's one example. There are other ones, like if we do and now if we reload the page, now whenever I mouse over the text, we should see that alert pop up also. Unless, does it have to be mouse over? Or is it, no wait, probably on mouse over. There we go. So when we use the on mouse over event, whenever we mouse over that text, then we see that alert pop up. All right, so pretty cool stuff. All right, let's get rid of on mouse over at least. Okay, so we've looked at functions and events a little bit. Now we want to talk just a little bit about CSS. So if you were here for Alyssa's talk earlier, you will have seen her talk about CSS also. On using CSS for styling, which is its primary function. CSS lets you change things like the size and color, the style of your HTML elements, but it also has some other benefits to it in that it gives us a common way of selecting items. And the important part about that will become more clear whenever we actually start talking about jQuery. But for now, let's leave CSS at that for now, and let's go on to the DOM, which is really where it becomes more important. So the DOM stands for the DOM the document object model. And what this is how your browser translates HTML into a format that it can understand. So it does things like interprets your HTML, and it ties all of the attributes about the elements of your page that it's easier to interact with. So here in this example, this is something from Twitter. If you click on that body element, it shows and it shows some CSS about it, things about what the background image is, and other things. So this is an example here. Let's go ahead and look at a live example here in the browser. So if we go back to the browser and we reload that page, that mouse over event goes away. Okay, good. So if we go over here into our simple little web page and look at it highlights them for us and shows us some information about it here in the right pane. So if we click on our header element, our H1, it tells us that the font size is 2em, which is a different way of saying how many pixels it is. I wouldn't worry too much about that right now. But it shows us information about what it is, and we can even go in here and I guess we can't. Let's see. We can do things like go and change this. Let's see. Font size is 3em. And you see over here it grew to be a bit larger. We can go and make it 10em and make it really big. So this is, again, the way that you can interact with parts of your web page in a more interactive way, because it lets you fiddle around with them directly. So yeah, this is what the DOM does. It makes it so that your web browser can show you these things in this sort of style that allows you to do things with it. So one of the things that's important is if you look down here at the bottom left-hand corner of the page, there's this set of elements here. And this is kind of the path to get to this element. So if you look at your HTML, you'll see that, okay, this button is inside this body, and this body is inside this HTML. And if we click on the H1, it'll be similar. It'll be H1 is inside body, which is inside of HTML. And if we click on head, head is inside HTML. So the reason why this path is important is because oftentimes we need a way to identify a particular item in our web page. You know, if we have a whole bunch of buttons and a whole bunch of H1s, we need some way to be able to tell them apart sometimes. So having access to that path is important. Okay, so now with that in mind, let's go ahead and talk about jQuery. So I'm missing a slide here, but that's okay. We'll just talk from here. So jQuery is arguably exists to allow you to do things to the interface of your web page, like the things that are displayed on the web page, in a very easy to use fashion. So it lets you do things easier and more concisely than you could do in regular JavaScript. So it's really good, it's really handy, and it lets you do some nice things that'll make your application more responsive. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So as I mentioned earlier, we are jQuery included into our web page. So let me go ahead and Google that real quick. jQuery CDN. CDN stands for Content Delivery Network. It's just a glorified way of saying that it's a central place where you can get something. So I'm going to copy this link for jQuery. Whichever one you pick doesn't matter too much. I usually go with uncompressed because it's a little bit easier to tinker with. So now we're going to go over to our text editor, and we're going to create a second script element here. So this will be another source, and the source will be, I wanted the link, not the text. And the source is going to be the location on the web with it, but that's okay. So let's go ahead and see how we can make sure that this actually has been included into our web page. So if we go back to our page and reload, we're going to pop back over to the console real quick. So the way that you interact with jQuery is that there's the special character, the $sign. The $sign and then a period signifies that this function you're trying to execute is a jQuery function. So we can do things like, let's see. Let's start here. Let's look at the text of our button. Okay, so what we want to find out is, okay, what text is in this H1, and then we'll want to find this out so that we can modify it later. But for now, let's find out. Now, in this case, our HTML is very, very simple. We only really have our tags. We don't have any classes on them or any IDs or anything that makes them very distinguishable. So let's go ahead and start by just looking at the H1 by itself. So we reference that by just typing in H1. And then if we want to get the text of this H1, we type text. There. So now we see that we've got the text out of our H1. And that's great. But we can also do some nice things with this text function. We can update the text of our H1 to, let's say, hello again. And then you see that it instantly changed the value of the text in our H1. So this is a really easy way for us to interact with things that are in our web page. It lets us modify things in a way that JavaScript by itself can do it, but it's not quite as easy as it is with jQuery. Okay, so we've got this. Now let's do something a little bit more complicated. So what if we have two H1s? Reload this page. So we've got hello world and hello again. And what if we want to modify our H1? Text. Okay. First of all, if we do text by itself, what do you think is going to happen? So right now we have two H1s. jQuery might have a difficult time figuring out which one is which. So let's see what happens. Both of our H1s just stuck together in this string. So we've asked jQuery, get me the text for all H1 existed in my page, and it obeyed. It went and got both of the texts from both of our H1s. And then what if we change this? What's going to happen? And, you know, I think when we do this, I mean, based on what we did before, it might be easy for you to guess. When we do this, what we're telling jQuery is, I want what's going to happen, just like we expect. So how can we make it so that we can, you know, modify only the H1 that we actually care about? And we have a couple of ways of doing this, but I'm going to go ahead and start by using the ID field. So this ID attribute lets us give this a unique name, if you will, for this H1. So let's call this first header. And let's call this one second header. Okay, so now we've got some IDs for these H1s. It gives them a unique way for us to access this. So let's reload our page. And if we go look at the DOM browser and look at our body and look at our H1s, then we see that the IDs show up here just as we expect them to. So if we go back to the console, now we're going to have to use a slightly different query. The way that you access IDs is with the hash symbol. So you put the hash, and then you put the name that you're trying to search for. In this case, let's modify first header. So if we do .text on first header, we should see hello world, which is what we see. If we change the text, this is the first header. Then that one changes. Now, here's a question for you. What's going to happen when we do h1.text? This is going to do. I mean, if you were following along earlier, when I was saying what this meant is, we're telling jQuery modify every h1 text field to have this text that I'm giving it. So, I mean, has that changed? Now that these have individual IDs, is jQuery going to be able to figure out this any differently? Generally obey you very carefully. So I've still told it, I want to modify the text of all these H1s, so change it to this. So that means even if you have some things that you want to do on one particular element, like using an ID, you can still access all of them with the same query that you wrote before and modify them all at once. So that's kind of the nice thing about jQuery. It can be as particular or as general as you want it to be. So it just makes it easier for you to do things the way that you want to do them. Okay, so let's go ahead and refresh our page and reset this again. And let's see what else we can do. So before, we wrote a function here that just brings up an alert when you click on it. But maybe we can do something a bit more interesting now that we have access to jQuery. So let's go ahead and make the size of the thing that we clicked on bigger. Or let's make the size of the first header bigger. So we're going to do again, hash says that we want to operate on something by its ID. I say first header dot size, and size. Okay, so at this point of things that match that query, and that's not quite what I want. jQuery change size, resize, width, animate height, change text size, font family, and font size. Let's see, font size. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than maybe we want to do right now. So let's see, can I do height? It's changing it in a different way. It's changing the height of an individual element in our page. So if we mouse over this one, we see that it's got a size of 37 pixels. So this blue bar denotes the size in pixels. The orange is its margin or padding. So if we mouse over here, we see that this one is much larger. So the size of this one is changed by 60 pixels. So, okay, let's go ahead and change the font. So we're going to use this .css function. We're going to, or rather, we're going to use font size. So we're going to use the CSS function. We're going to give it a font size, and we'll give it one that we want. So let's do something cool, like say every time we click on the button, we change the font size, we increase it by one pixel. So the way that we're going to do that is first we need to get the current font size. So the way that we should be able to do that is by using the CSS function and giving it this font size argument. Make sure that works. Okay, yeah, so that's what we expect. When we execute this, we're telling it, give me the font size from the CSS of the thing that has an ID first header. So that gives us the size in pixels of the first header. So if we want to change that, all we have to do is give it an argument. So we could say that we can do this, and now let's see how we're actually going to get this done. So what I want to do is increase the size of this by 1 pixel every time we click on it. So the first thing that we need is to know what is the current size, and we kind of figured out how to do that already. If we do this function, then we can say var current size is this. So when we execute this, this is going to give us the current size. It's going to give us the current size in pixels. Okay. So what we look at this for 1 second. I'll show you. Oh, the mic is out? Let's have a look here. And this. And sound.
Hey, everybody. Oh, sorry. Oh, he's back.
And okay. We're good now? Okay. Wonderful. USB, save. Okay. All right, so let's continue on here. Screen sharing is still going. Okay. So what we need to do is find a way to get just the number without the px part, and then add that to another number. So let's see. So we can do, like I said before, use this split function. And let's see if we can use split to take off the parts that we don't care about. So we do split on px, then we get this element, or this array that has a 42 in it. Let's see, can I do 0? Okay. Clear this up so that the console goes back to the top of the screen so I can see it a little better. Okay. So what I'm doing here is I'm telling jQuery, give me the font size of the thing that has the ID of first header, and then I want you to split it on this string px. So split it into chunks starting where px starts. And then I want you to give me the first thing that that you get out of that split. So we do that, and that gives us 42. But right now, this is still not a number. It's still a string. The quotation marks indicates that it's a string. So even if we did 42 plus 1, what we're going to get is 421 because it adds that one character onto the end of the string. So how do we convert that into a number? jQuery, convert text to number. Parse int. Okay, so this is going to get a little bit convoluted, so I apologize for that. We're going to clean this up a little bit when we write our function. So we add parse int and add our closing parentheses to put this whole thing inside of parse int. We hit enter, and now you see that there aren't any quotation marks around here, so this is just 42. It's the number 42. So if we add 1, then we get 43, and that's what we expect. So let's go ahead and take the stuff that we have hacked together and put it into our function and make it look a little nicer. Okay, so we've got the current size. Let's call this current size in pixels, just so that we make sure we keep this clear. Let's paste in our code that we got from before, and then what we're going to do is, so this here is now represented by current size in pixels. And now let's call this current size in number. Okay, so we are taking the string that we get that's going to tell us how many pixels it are, so it'll be like 32px. We're going to take that and split it on that px and take the first thing that we get from it. That'll be the actual number, and then we're going to put that through parse int. That's going to give us the actual numerical value of it, and from then we can use that here, and we can add 1. And what we also want to do here is put this in parentheses, because we want to make sure that it adds these two numbers together before it does anything else like adding the string to it. Okay, so this is a little bit complicated, but I think this is going to work now. So let's go ahead and save this. So we've got our do something function now. It's going to get the current size of our header, and it's going to add 1 to it and make that the new size anytime we click that button. So let's pop back over. Let's reload our page. Everything gets reset, and then when we click, we see that it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And if we keep clicking, it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay, so that's pretty cool. So yeah, so we've got something now. Interact with the stuff that's in our page in a very cool way. Yeah, so the code itself looks a little bit ugly, but that's the sometimes nature of having to work with stuff like this, particularly when you're trying to modify CSS elements. In general, I try to avoid that. I usually try and work just with the more simple things like text and height. But in this case, for this, so that's kind of a pretty quick and dirty overview of a little bit of JavaScript and a little bit of jQuery. So I hope that this was, a good talk for you. This is the first time I gave this talk, so if you have any questions or feedback, please feel free to get in touch with me. You got me on Twitter, which I usually use for following, but I'm finding questions there.